Welcome to the Crypto Compliance Podcast by Gatenox.
Pawel Kuskowski, crypto compliance. We're going to talk about compliance issues in crypto world, and we start with FTX. I'm here with Carol Van Cleef and Art Middlemiss. Carol, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi. Well, thank you, Pawel. I'm Carol Van Cleef. I'm an attorney as well as a consultant. I've been embedded in the, and I say it that way, in the crypto space since solidly 2012, and have been involved in and around digital asset issues long before that, including representing the first digital currency system to be prosecuted by the U.S. government. I was hired on the backside of the prosecution, but nonetheless, it gave me a great deal of insight into the process. And before that, I've been a longstanding bank regulatory lawyer. And thank you for having me today.
Thank you. Art?
Hey, Pawel. Art Middlemiss. I'm a lawyer in New York. Thank you for having me here today. As a prosecutor, I handled fraud. We handled, back in 2005, I think, one of the first prosecutions involving a cryptocurrency, involving an entity called Gold Age, which later morphed into Liberty Reserve. I've worked as a banking compliance officer in terms of money laundering, sanctions, and anti-corruption. And currently I'm in private legal practice, and most of the stuff I do bounces off of those types of issues.
Thank you. Yeah, so we met today to speak about, I think, one of the most interesting case right now in crypto, about FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried. So just to catch up on what we actually know or what's actually in the public space, we have SBF, that's for short, was raised by two Stanford law professors and went to MIT, which is beautiful career, right? And beautiful start for them, what's supposed to be a great startup. In 2017, he founded Alameda Research, a quant trading firm. At just 25 years old, he made millions by trading on Bitcoin's price differences between Asia and the US. 2 years later, SBF launched FTX, which became a top 3 global cryptocurrency exchange. Valued at some point at 33 billion USD, investors such as Sequoia Capital, Paradigm, Ontario's Teachers Pensions Fund, which I think is going to be very interesting conversation around this. So the investor size is very exciting. Personal wealth of SBF rose to 26 billion. At some point, he used this fortune to first become the number 2 donor of the Democratic Party in 2021-2022, host a conference with Tom Brady and other celebrities, plaster FTX all over cities and arenas, and bail out crypto firms. And I think, for me personally, when I saw what's happening with buying out, right, or helping like companies like BlockFi and etc. This is where I started. Okay, something is going wrong. It's not something that typically you would see out of the blue, especially when you have token involved. But something like this is happening. First point, Art, what's your view about the setup of FTX in Bahamas? Why you think is it good, bad from the regulatory perspective?
I don't know if it's good or bad. I think from an investor perspective, if you've got your money, if you trust your money to someone, you want them to be in a regime or in a jurisdiction that's safe. And one of the reasons why FTX probably wanted to go to the Bahamas and not the US is because the United States currently lacks a stable regulatory regime, where it's either viewed by people as being too unpredictable or too harsh. And so you try to go elsewhere. And one of the places where you would go might be the Bahamas. And so the Bahamas now, with FTX exploding, their regulator is in something of a pickle, because they're going to want to be viewed as a stable and serious regulatory regime where people can go and it's safe. And a lot of people are going to say, hey, this thing blew up on your watch, which means you're not stable and safe. And I don't really want to have my money there. So for the Bahamas, this is a horrible public relations disaster in terms of the perception of their regulatory environment. And I would anticipate that they're going to try to act very strongly to try to deal with it.
Well, and in fact, with the news over the weekend, it sounds like they have taken some very strong steps. I was real time in Twitter spaces, listening to people who are on the ground in Bahamas, filming the entry of the Bahamian officials into the apartment of SPF, and then eventually his detainment to the police headquarters. So I think you're absolutely right, Art, that they've worked very hard. In fact, I know that the folks who are on this in this conversation today are well aware of FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, which is a standard-setting body for anti-money laundering and other types of anti-financial crimes standards worldwide. And FATF has a name and shame list. And for many years, the Bahamas was on that name and shame list and came off with a great deal of celebration in 2020. In addition, they've put this whole regime for regulating crypto in place. They're one of the leaders in the world in taking that step forward and committing to not only creating a legal structure for this type of an entity to be set up, but also to set up the regulatory background to provide some real backbone to it. So I think you're absolutely right. This is a tough blow, but how they respond is going to be absolutely critical on a going forward basis. But I don't think we can let the U.S. off that easily. Because, and I'm not sure I would totally blame the U.S. for the lack of regulatory clarity, which I know a lot of people in the crypto space do. But there are definitely some gaps, and that did that lead to this, or do we just have old-fashioned fraud? And, when you have old-fashioned fraud happening, no matter how good the regulatory system is, no matter how good the internal controls may be, it still gets through.
Yeah. And, Art, you mentioned that there's the U.S. regime is, you cannot rely on this to some extent. But at the same time, we have like Coinbase, Kraken, well-established exchanges, so typically, when I look at this from like overall compliance perspective, it's immediately raising some questions, right? Why it's actually in this offshore at the end jurisdiction? Is there anything, one of the questions which I would ask here is, what's the recovery? What's the court, let's say, remit over there? Is it U.S. courts which you can actually apply in Bahamas, or you need to go to local courts to recover any funds if anything is available still in the FTX? So what's your, let's say, experience with this?
Well, one of my experiences, Pawel, is that when there's a massive fraud that's multi-jurisdictional in scope, the only ones that are going to wind up making any money are the lawyers, because there's going to be a ton of litigation in the United States about this. And there's going to be a ton of litigation in the Bahamas and likely elsewhere where people say, where did my money go? You promised me one thing and you sold me another. And I want the thing that I was promised, and I want you to pay my money back in damages because I didn't get it, right? So that's one answer to the question. I think also what I heard you asking is why, or what's the difference between an exchange that is located and regulated in the United States and one that's located elsewhere? Well, if you're located in the United States, one of the things that you're selling to your customers is transparency. I'm safe. I'm regulated. I report to the government. I've worked with the government to set up how I should operate safely and soundly. Gemini, for example, put out a statement that basically said, we comply, we're safe, you're okay keeping your crypto and your assets with us. And so as a term of marketing, they're trying to distinguish now themselves and to get paid for really, the regulatory burden of being in the United States. They're trying to say that's safe and it's worth buying. And other people are saying it's cheaper and easier to operate elsewhere. This case illustrates the risks of what happens when you operate elsewhere. Carol?
Oh, there's so many things that you just said, Art.
I know. That's why I turned it right over to you.
I sort of got stuck at the beginning when you said, when you have a fraud like this, that its lawyers are going to get rich. And you didn't say anything about the bankruptcy proceedings, because I think if you take fraud plus bankruptcy proceedings, then clearly you're going to have, a much richer legal community combined.
Don't forget the lobbyists and the people who are trying to write the regulations.
Well, that's another piece, and I don't know whether we want to jump into that yet, because that's another quagmire to go down. But to talk a little bit about the U.S. regulatory system, I'll be very honest and say that going back to that 2018-19 timeframe when FTX just started to come on the scene, I immediately reacted that this is a different organization, because before they opened their doors, they were going and getting money transmitter licenses in the U.S. And having worked in the money transmitter licensing space for 20 plus years at that point, personally, I was amazed, because we just don't see a brand new entry into the marketplace taking that kind of a step to get regulated. So I thought, wow, this is a little different. And it was at that point that I started digging, and I realized that his parents were Stanford Law School professors. And I was like, okay, I think maybe that's the difference here. Now, it's been very interesting to watch the conversation over the last few days, that there hasn't been a lot about the U.S. entity other than an early tweet to say that if you were a customer of the U.S. entity, your funds were safe. And one of the reasons, the big differentiation here, is that the Bahamian, and I hopefully am saying that correctly, entity had was not backed. Their what they had on record was not one for one. And in the U.S., because of the U.S. money transmitter licenses, it was a one-for-one correspondence. So for every dollar or every Bitcoin, though apparently there was no Bitcoin in the system, for every whatever crypto, there was that backing the activities. So there was not the chance of being the same kind of run on the bank that we've seen with respect to FTX, the parent company.
Yeah, I think you smoothly moved to very intriguing question. I think in the entire crypto space, the client money, right? So in traditional finance, you have the segregation. Typically, it should be segregation of client money from any other funds within the organization. Typically, you should not be able to use this money in order to fund any other activities of the company, right? This is protected. This should be actually in the segregated accounts. We don't have anything similar, as far as I know, in crypto space, right? But, that's something which is also, because what I heard is potentially in Bahamas, you actually have this segregated accounts requirements, but they simply were not implemented. So what do you think? I mean, what's your view here?
Well, from one of the criticisms of the Bahamian regime would be that if that requirement existed, it wasn't enforced. Mm-hmm. And the question will be, why wasn't it enforced? And one of the answers that the Bahamian regulator will try to prevent people from reaching is that it wasn't enforced because the Bahamian regulator did a bad job, right? But Pawel, what you're saying, Carol, what you said before really illustrates the value of transparency, In the United States, if you have to have your funds that you're holding for other people in one place, and you have to be accountable for being able to show that you have the funds to match the assets on hold, as a customer, you have some kind of comfort that you're going to be able to get your money back if something goes wrong, right? Whereas in a different regime, in a different jurisdiction, if something goes wrong, you've bought a different level of risk, right? So arguably, your asset is not worth the same as it would be if it was in a more stable jurisdiction, because you have a higher risk of losing it if something goes wrong. And when things go wrong, that usually is the crux. That's the point where people start to say, how am I going to fix this, right? And one of the places where you can look to for experience is 1933 in the United States, when people started to put rules around how people were going to sell securities and the importance of transparency and providing people all the material information they needed to make the investment. And so one of the questions that a prosecutor may ask here with respect to the owner of FTX is, hey, would it have made a difference to you in terms of buying a token if you knew that somebody was going to take that token and artificially prop up its price by keeping a great big pile of it for yourself away from the market? And the answer to that question is probably going to be yes, which is a pretty good indicator that there was a massive fraud that was undergoing here. Carol, have I teed up enough topics there for you?
Oh, and then
that's what I'm here for.
I think that my view is that we're so early in the discovery process of what happened here. And every day something else new is coming out, this is going to be an incredible learning experience for everyone, and sort of figuring out what do we do to prevent the next one. That doesn't help the people who are in the middle of it right now. I think what's been incredible, again, having sat in Twitter Spaces for many, many more hours than I ever should have over the last few days, is how the community as a whole has come together, pulling pieces of information from around the world. Sometimes a little bit too much detail, including tracking the plane that was using the flight tracker with a plane on Friday night, and everyone was certain that SBF had escaped to Argentina. And someone this morning said, "Well, why would he go there? There's an extradition treaty in place for the U.S." But that's the level of, and I told you earlier, real time on Saturday that people were watching things happen. This is also going to the data. So there's, again, as you said, you teed up a number of different issues. One is data. One of the things that crypto has been heralded for is its transparency. The fact that you can see transactional activity on chain. And I know Pawel knows this better than anyone else, having been the founder of one of the original blockchain analytics companies. But the question I have, and this harkens back to 9/11 in the United States. My son was 11 years old at the time. He'll hate me for telling this story. But as we were sitting that day watching the TV and watching at least the information about what had happened come forward, I said, just wait. Let's see how long it takes for us to find out that we knew in advance that this was going to happen. And that's sort of the way I look at events like this, is that what did we know in advance that could have helped us better, even if we weren't the regulators behind the curtain, so to speak, with that access to the books and records in a way that nobody else really can get to, or should be able to, or we can get to. And what could we find out about it? So I think as we were putting pieces together, what the blockchain analytics tools were able to give us in advance of this event are going to be incredibly useful in helping us, do surveillance and watch for that next event. And I know, having been very close to, the development of a number of tools in this space, not just pure blockchain analytics tools, but other types of surveillance tools, that I think as time goes on, there's going to be a very interesting pattern. I've heard the reports that as least 2 months ago, there was enough indication that something was wrong, and that was based on the data, much less, people having individual, the human element of things didn't feel quite right. There's
so
one
Carol,
other.
I'm sorry, Carol.
No, one other point I wanted to make there is that we do rely upon, I think, in times like this, people are saying, well, why didn't the regulator know more? And I think that's a very good question. And if you look at the regulatory process in the United States across different types of industries that are subject to regulation, one, the regulators aren't perfect by any means. There's lots of things that they've missed over the years. Two is we forget that at least the U.S. entity was only established in 2019, which was, about 3 years ago in my books. And that's barely time for the IRS to send in a letter saying we're coming in to do an AML compliance review under Title 31 with the entity. And then the last point is that the regulators often rely upon third parties, third-party auditors, third-party reviewers for anti-money laundering compliance. And sometimes, and that takes time to work its way through the system. So we would just probably be starting to come up with on a regulatory cycle examinations where they could really start to get to the heart of what the practices were in the entity.
So a couple things, Carol. And first, with respect to Twitter, what came to mind when you said people were watching the flight as it went to Argentina was that was the 2022 equivalent of watching the white Bronco on the freeway as the bad guy tries to get away. But there's another car reference that I think that I can make based on what you said, which is that, what happened in October when Binance looked at this entity and got under the hood? It did pre-acquisition due diligence. It looked at what was there, and it promptly decided, I don't want any part of that. I'm about to invest a lot of money in this thing. I've now taken a look at it, and I don't want it. And so you had an acquirer get under the hood and then publicly provide information that likely was one of the causes of the eventual bank run, which resulted in investors, losing a lot of their money as this thing collapsed, and people wondered where the money went, including in the hack, right? And so it really does raise the question of whether or not we want people to be under the hood of these exchanges in terms of figuring out where the money is, how it's being kept, and what it's being used for. And one of the issues is, with respect to the IRS that you mentioned, that's the primary regulator for a money service business, for a money transmitter in the U.S. And that's the primary way.
Primary regulator for anti-money laundering compliance in the U.S., not for safety and soundness.
That's a great point. One of the primary regulators for anti-money laundering, right? And so on a cycle for the IRS to get into an MSB or for the state regulator to get in, that might be right. But if you're setting up the equivalent of a bank or a broker-dealer in the United States, you've got people under your hood figuring out what you're going to do in terms of safety and soundness before you open the door. I do not know if the same is true in the Bahamas. And I do not know if that's why they went there. And the fact that we don't know, speaks to sort of the insecurity that people should have in the market when the entity that's holding their money is located elsewhere. What do I know about that entity? Is my money safe there? Those are questions that you hope people would ask, but they don't really ask every day.
Yeah.
So I have another Twitter admission here, is that I also sat in a Twitter space yesterday with CZ from Binance. where he did describe how he came to make that decision, that fateful decision back at the end of October. And I do think we have, I don't think it's a new phrase that's been coined by any means, but we've now heard it from CZ and from someone maybe even bigger than CZ, Elon Musk. And both of them have used bullshit monitor in reference to SBS, that their bullshit monitor went off with respect to SBF on multiple occasions. For Elon, apparently SBF went and wanted to invest funds in the Twitter acquisition, of all things, and Elon didn't think that he could really deliver, that there was real substance there. And for CZ, what he laid out yesterday were a number of points, sort of those red flags that you would look for, not dissimilar to what Jesse Powell also put out there. And he just didn't think that things added up. The type of numbers they were reporting, the type of spending that they were doing, it didn't make sense for what he could see with his various databases of activity that was really going on in the through that organization.
It's too good to be true, right? And that's
precisely
why I think you monitor for bullshit, but you're happy when you detect it. So maybe they said that their bullshit detector went
you're right. I'm sorry. Right? So monitor detector, you're right.
But the hallmark of fraud, and probably what they're talking about, is that you have this thing and it looks like it's too good to be true. And lo and behold, almost every time something looks to be too good to be true, it is, right? If you look at Madoff, for example, he had returns that were amazing for 20 years. It's impossible. You can't do that. It was too good to be true. It was bullshit. Sorry.
So let's talk about, I think, one of the important note is that crypto markets or crypto people would not rely on regulations, but they rely on the market, right? And you have a lot of indication from the market. I'm just reading who are the investors of FTX. So the Series B round, 900 million, was done by Sequoia Capital, BlackRock, SoftBank. But before you had Singapore state-owned fund Temasek, Tiger Global, Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. Some of these people, some of the people from the fund. So you can, from the market perspective, you can say, they invested. They must have done really proper due diligence. Come on, Sequoia Capital. These guys are just making miracles. So how much I think the crypto world would rely more on them than actually on the regulations, right? And also you have some of the people from the funds actively promoting FTX investment, right? And so, which is you can say that some of them would be celebrities and some of them could be treated as celebrities. So you have celebrity endorsement for FTX. So what's your view on this?
Carol?
Yeah. Oh, I was waiting for you to take the lead on that one.
Well, what I was going to say is that it's easier for us three to sit here with 2020 hindsight and say, my God, how did people not see this before it happened? Because those investors are serious and they must have done due diligence, correct? Yeah. And it depends on what kind of information was available for them to see before they invested. And also a material question would be how much they invested. Did they bet the farm on this? Or did they do the equivalent of throwing $10 on the Giants on Sunday in terms of a bet on it? I don't know the answer to that question. It does speak to the difference of the kind of due diligence that you could do if you're actually going to acquire or take over the entity, when you can get under the hood like Binance did, and then make a decision about whether or not you want to buy this thing. That's a different level of due diligence than you can have than if you invested. And it will be very interesting going forward to see if investors like that demand access of that type so that they can make a more informed decision about whether they want to commit their funds and their investors' funds into an entity like this, right? If you start attracting money from pensions and retired cops, that's a great way to draw the attention of prosecutors who want to make sure that that money is safe and get really upset when that money goes walkabout.
Yeah.
I think this is I've been trying to sort of plot out all of the different facets of life that this case is going to ultimately touch upon. We haven't gotten to the legislative piece yet. But I think you've hit on a very important issue, and that is, what is the culpability of when we say investors here, of the venture capital funds that have put money in. And I think it's going to be interesting to see if any of these venture capital funds get sued by their investors. That may be a whole additional level of lawyers getting rich in this game, because, I think, Art, you did a nice job of, what are the standards? Well, how are they making these investments? $900 million going into an entity that, melts down as rapidly as this did. What did they really know about the practices? And with some of the red flags, not the least of which I think the Sequoia situation has been very much in the news.
Sequoia, Carol, tell us about Sequoia, because this is very, very interesting.
Well, I'm still not sure I entirely understand, what the right order was. Did Sequoia make the investment in FTX?
Yes, and FTX is the LP, which is bringing almost equivalent, at least this is what you hear on the market, equivalent of the money into Sequoia Capital, right? Which is a very interesting question, because effectively probably the net is close to zero for Sequoia, and they actively promoted the investment. If there is let's say they did the very light DD, I don't know if this is true, right? But if this would be the case, what is the fraud definition for this, or is there anything,
Well, I mean, if I come to you and say, hey, you're an investment firm and I'm going to give you $200 million, and then you as the investment firm turn around and invested it in me, for the investment firm, have I lost anything in doing it? But, or was it the other way around? And that's one of the pieces that I'm not quite sure. But I think one of the things that's disturbing in what I've heard is that FTX ran its own venture capital firm. And when they invested in a company, the requirement was that company hold the invested funds in FTX. So we have a whole tier of companies where they made investments, and those investments were sitting on the books, and those companies are going to die now, many of them probably, because they can't get access to the capital the working capital that they thought they had to build their company. And will there be somebody who's going to be able to come in and step into the shoes of FTX to help them?
Right. Which is actually, Carol, that element of self-dealing, to the extent the Bahamian regulator appears to be fired up about this, their actions are primarily based on that element of self-dealing. Where did the money go? Was it disclosed in terms of where it was going to go, and who's to blame for that? But you bring up another subset of people who are going to make a lot of money with respect to this, which are the consultants, right? Who are going to come in and have advice and ideas about how to best set up the apparatus internally, and who are going to be, tracing the money and trying to figure out where it went.
Yeah. On FTT, there's another angle to the very interesting, conversation, the token itself. So where was it? Is it was issued from Bahamas as well, or where was this the domiciled? Do you know anything on this, Carol?
To be honest, the token piece is sort of that last piece that I haven't really been focused on, other than to know that, that's been at the center of a lot of the issues around the financial stability of the entity. And it was the fact that Binance owned a chunk of the tokens and eventually essentially dumped them in the marketplace that really led to the downfall of the price in the token. I will admit, and I've done this somewhat publicly, that I'm not a big believer in tokenomics to start with. That it's never been something that's been particularly meaningful. It was interesting to sit in again on another Twitter space in the last few days where someone was saying, well, it's absolutely essential when you were going to investors. Part of what the investors were buying were, buying an opportunity to get a bucket of tokens. And if you're going to those investors, you've got to make sure you've got your tokenomics right. And I'm thinking to myself, what does that really mean? I think it's really an issue of how much am I going to get, and at what point am I going to I'm going to be able to sell them in the marketplace, and how fast can I get out of them if I want to, or how much liquidity will be in them ultimately. So a number of questions like that are important, but it's just become a vehicle for enriching the deals for the VCs.
And is this, some from the, let's say, was this utility token? Should this fall under the SEC requirements? Where we are with this kind of conversation, do you think it's going to come to this conversation? What type of token it was, and what is the responsibility for whoever, issued this token or was trading this token? And the question is whether, if this would be regulated token, like SEC regulated, would it prevent anything?
Well, go ahead, Karen.
No, go ahead.
Please.
No.
Well, you've gotten into a realm where it's a complicated question, right? And there are a lot of different ideas that are intertwined with that. On the one hand, you have a component of the public that would see their purchase of the token as an investment. So if I buy it at $22 and it goes up to its high of 80, I'm really happy because my investment has gained a lot of money. And it's fair to say that people would invest in Apple, right? Or what people would more normally think of as a security, with that thought process in mind. I'm going to buy Apple low. I hope the price goes up, and I'm going to sell it high, and I'm going to make money. And that's an investment. And when you start marketing investments or securities like that to the public, you go back to 1933 again, you do have entities like the US SEC that are involved. And you have requirements then that people have to disclose all the material facts that would make a difference to somebody in their decision to buy that thing, right? On the other hand, if you look at it as a currency, something that I'm going to buy and sell, right? Then you have it more as a dollar, right? And it's a different regulatory environment that would regulate buys and sells of currency and currency swaps than you would securities. And that was one of the debates that is going to be put more into focus as a result of this, I think. Carol?
Yeah, and I think it's been heavily rumored that the SEC, the U.S. SEC, is investigating, as well as the Department of Justice. The question is, what aspects of this whole saga are they actually investing, and to what extent, I think, will the token play a role in that investigation? My guess is that there are multiple issues that they can explore, including just the trading generally on their exchange. There's probably lots of issues as to whether they had appropriately walled off customers in states where they weren't allowed to do transactional activity, whether some of the transactional activity involved things that would be securities. So I think there's a number of issues. So will the token be the center point of the SEC action? I'm not sure at this point. Clearly, there's a lot of money that was tied up with it. But a number of the exchanges have come out with their own token with the idea of converting, whatever currency was coming into and onto the exchange into that token, so that you would eliminate some of the costs associated with the currency conversion or currency exchange, to make it a faster, a less expensive type of a transaction, plus one that generated some value for the exchange.
Certainly, Pawel, it has a lot of elements of a traditional securities fraud, right? That being a pump and dump, where you've got the securities and you manipulate the price either by playing with the volume, the amount of sales that take place, or the quantity of sales that take place at a certain time, to generate an upward interest in the price of the security. So if you can manipulate that security or that coin for the price to go up, for example, by holding a lot of it yourself, when no one else knows that you have it, and they think those coins are being traded in the open market, and then when something goes wrong, you dump them on the public, you start to get to a place where an investor or a securities regulator can get pretty worked up pretty easily about that, because you're taking a lot of concepts that involve tokens and coins that aren't shares of stock, but all of a sudden you're able to say, that's a pump and dump. I know what to do with a pump and dump as a prosecutor. I know the type of evidence that I'm looking for. I know the types of emails and communications I'm looking for. I know the types of trading records that I'm looking for. And I can fit that case into that box. And it looks like a pump and dump. It smells like a pump and dump. It probably is going to get prosecuted as a pump and dump.
Well, and I guess, is that the linchpin to allow the SEC to come in? Because the way I see it is that the worst part of all of this is that there's so many people who had their funds, whether they brought them in the form of USD or in Bitcoin or other forms of crypto, and were custodying those assets on the exchange, and they've lost that. And, how do you tie that into a securities fraud, other than having potentially the token as a vehicle to get there?
But Carol, you know this as well. It's not directly to your point, but if the SEC, if I'm the people who ran this and the SEC gets involved, I'm really happy, because the SEC is going to treat this as a civil matter. The people who I'm scared of are at the Department of Justice, who are going to treat this as a crime, and they're going to be looking to put people in jail.
Well, and we do know the Department of Justice is at the table. So, and I think it was quite interesting to many observers. I don't think it's any particular secret of that Binance has been under the review of the Department of Justice for probably a fairly long period of time. And I think when it started surfacing that Binance might be the buyer, I know that in compliance circles, at least, a lot of eyebrows were raised about that. And in fact, there was a fairly lengthy Reuters story about Binance's issues with DOJ that Reuters published back on October 22nd. So I think what's critical, and I think you brought up a very good point, is the DOJ is really geared up. They have put a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of people into the crypto space in the last year or so. Were they watching this one as closely, FTX, as closely as some of the other cases that they've been working on? Over time, we will learn that better. Certainly, they've accelerated and probably shifted people off of other investigations to get to the bottom of this quickly. And, when we start talking DOJ, we start talking about a whole bunch of different crimes that they could be looking at, from wire fraud to money laundering. And Art, you can probably give us another half dozen or dozen that they've gotten their bag of tricks to pull out.
I can tell you that's a whole nother raft of happy lawyers.
Yeah, and I think, also when the other aspect is that if you read news like in Bloomberg, Reuters, or anything, it's almost like the sentiment of, finally, they're going down, right? Finally, this crypto world is going down. Why we should save anyone who put this amount, and we also see this in crypto world, right? Why you put your money in FTX, and if something goes sideways, why you actually complain? This is crypto. This is Wild West. It's not your key, not your coin. You should put this in DeFi, and I think DeFi is actually very much a winner of this space currently. At least we don't see much things happening there yet. But from your perspective, what we can do to prevent this, and I just give you one idea, which I discussed with some of my colleagues, right, is that proof of reserve, that's something that we see more and more with cryptocurrency exchanges, plus constant monitoring of hot wallets and cold wallets of cryptocurrency exchange. That's actually pretty powerful tools you would have. Of course, you don't see the fiat, let's say, side of the transaction, right? But at the same time, that's very, very powerful already information. Do you think that this type of solution could prevent this going forward? Or if not, what would be your thinking, except simply bringing everyone to the US and putting them under heavy oversight?
Well, if I can jump in on this one first, because this is an issue that I've spent a lot of time thinking about in a variety of settings, but particularly in crypto, because for a long time now, we know that the underlying technology of crypto is not, it brings with it the if you want to look at it, the benefits of helping us create tools that will allow us to have more transparency into the transactional activity, just to the point that you said, the ability to monitor the hot wallets, the cold wallets, the transactional flows, even getting into intercepting at the node level, seeing things going in and out of the system, and even being able to intercept transactions before they're actually processed. So I think we're in a time of incredible discovery, and implementation of these kinds of tools. The question, I think, in my mind, is who's going to be responsible for that? Is that going to be private sector initiatives, or is it going to be public sector initiatives? And certainly we know that there are certain elements of the public sector, the government, that have become very adept in using the blockchain analytic tools in particular. And is it going to be, is that where, I'm sorry, I've got a number of thoughts that come into mind immediately on that, is that as soon as you get them trained up in the government, though, they're getting recruited away into private sector. So can we maintain an educated base that can work with these tools in the government, maintain them long enough to, see through an entire investigation, for example? How do we create that sort of early warning system? If the blockchain analytics tools were able to detect, going back a couple of months ago, that there were issues at FTX, who should be sounding the bell and what should that early intervention scheme look like from a regulatory standpoint? And at what point do you potentially bring together the public and the private sector? I've been an advocate now for a while, and I've got a piece that I did a couple of years ago of really turning this into a public-private partnership, and where the compliance departments of whether it's a bank or a crypto exchange they're spending, millions and millions and millions of dollars on an annual basis, and really doing some great work. But why not turn those into at least cost neutral, not a total drain on the system, but turn them into at least cost neutral, if not a revenue generating operation, by allowing them to participate in some of the benefits of early intervention or interceding or making use of their examination fold. So I know I've packed a lot into that, but I'm a big believer that the technology can help us in this process, but we need to have a better understanding of who's going to take the lead and create mechanisms to allow that technology to be fully used in its best way possible.
Yeah, Pawel, the only thing I would add to that is that, I think the industry has recognized that now it's almost a victim of its own success, where it's so big that a lot of people can get hurt. And it's not just people who are in the community, in an insular environment where everybody knows each other. It's everybody on the street who is able to access an exchange, who can throw money into a token with the hopes of making money. And with that success is going to come regulation, right? It's going to come control, because without it, there are going to be episodes like the FTX case where a lot of people get hurt and there's an outcry. And so in the industry, I think the people who are working with the government cooperatively to come up with a set of regulations that makes sense for the industry are smart. It's inevitable that regulators are going to regulate. They should work with regulators to come up with that kind of scheme. The one thing I would say, based on my observations, is that in the industry, there's such a repulsion almost to say, we're not a bank. I don't want anything to do with what banks do. And the bottom line is that banks, for the last 22 years, right, since 2001, have spent literally billions and billions and billions of dollars trying to figure out how to build policies, procedures, and ways to work through these issues that make sense and allow for the business, and at the same time protect the investing public and protect people from money laundering. And in the industry, people should be smart enough to know that they don't have to recreate the wheel. There's a lot that people can learn from banks. You don't have to be a bank, but you're an idiot if you don't try to leverage what banks have developed over the last 22 years and adopt what's good and reject what you think doesn't work with you, and work with regulators to make sure that in the end, the compliance product that you come up with makes sense for you. That's what has to happen. It's going to happen. It's just a question of whether the industry is dragged there or whether the industry takes control of that conversation and makes it come out the way that they want it to.
Well, Art, you raised a couple of very good points there. And I think one of the things that we have seen over the last year and a half in particular, is there's a fairly significant brain drain from the banking industry, compliance departments into the compliance departments of crypto exchanges. So I would say that the level of sophistication in the compliance departments have gone way up. Obviously, we've had a couple of fairly significant enforcement actions that are, bringing home the point to the crypto firms that they do need to improve their compliance. Irony of this entire situation is, if you talk to people out on the street in the compliance, in the back rooms of compliance departments, they will say
those smoky back rooms where all the cool kids hang out.
The FTX compliance department, at least in the US, was pretty darn good. state of the art in terms of tools, in terms of expertise, and so on. So, were they complying with the Bank Secrecy Act and doing what they were required to do? Time will tell whether they were missing anything. This is sort of harkens back to the days of Bit Instant, which is, for the real old timers in the room, how many people remember the Charlie Shrem venture? And Charlie had a compliance program, had a pretty good compliance program. He was filing SARs regularly. There was one problem. There was one piece of the business that SARs weren't being filed on. And those are the transactions that were being done that were going, crypto conversions that were going into Silk Road. And that's what he was ultimately prosecuted on.
All right. All right, Carol, I think, this should be closing line for us. Perfect. I think, it went really well. Thank you very much. There's a first edition of Crypto Compliance. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pawel. Great to see you, Carol.